Welcome to session 5 of our banned books class. We have a very relevant topic today. Let me just give you a little bit of background and then I'll introduce our presenter for the afternoon. But parents, activists, school board officials, and lawmakers around the country are challenging books, as you know, at a pace not seen in decades. And the American Library Association said in a preliminary report it has received an unprecedented 330 reports of book challenges, each of which can include multiple books last fall. The advocacy group, No Left Turn in Education, maintains lists of books it says are used to spread radical and racist ideologies to students, including Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States and Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Those who are demanding certain books be removed insist this is an issue of parental rights and choice, and that all parents should be free to direct the upbringing of their children. However, others say prohibiting these titles altogether violates the rights of other parents and the rights of children who believe access to these books is important. Many school libraries already have mechanisms in place to stop individual students from checking out books of which their parents disapprove. To help us sort all of this out, we have with us today Ramona Caponegro, who will be speaking about earlier challenges and bans to children's books in the US and how the current wave of banning both mirrors and extends these earlier efforts, and how children's books have become more scrutinized in recent decades. Ramona is the curator of the Baldwin Library of Historical Children's Literature at the University of Florida, a former children's literature professor at Eastern Michigan University, and she has published essays about children's book awards and developing diverse children's literature courses. She co-wrote the documentary Tell Me Another Story about the need for diversity in picture books and created educational materials for the Newbery Practitioner's Guide and the Ezra Jack Keats Foundation. She chaired the Pura Belpré Award and the Phoenix Picture Book Award committees, co-chaired the Pura Belpré Award 25th Anniversary Task Force, and is a member of the 2023 Caldecott Committee. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Ramona Caponegro.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, lovely. Ready? And yes. Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to get us started with just a little bit of see what books may have come up, what children's books, I'm just going to do a couple, you may have heard about with controversies either in the course of the past few weeks or before. And I know we have at least one children's librarian in the house, so she may have a little bit of an advantage here. But Maurice Sendak's In the Night Kitchen, which was a Caldecott honor book in 1970. Cover familiar to anybody? Say. Do you remember why this book was banned? Nudity, yes. This book, which is kind of a surreal nighttime journey between New York City and being baked in bread, has a little boy with full frontal nudity. And this book was very controversial, still gets some challenges, but when it came out in the early 70s, it was controversial. And it made the school library journal because actually a librarian published an article about how she thought, solved the problem with white paint and painting little shorts on the character. And I wanted to point this out as an example because I'll talk a lot today about how librarians are at the front of the battle to prevent books being challenged and banned, which is very true. But also there are some librarians sometimes who do think that librarians run the political spectrum like everybody else, all of their professions, who do also help with challenging or keeping books out of the hands of children. Another one that I'm guessing may have come up in the last few weeks, and Tango Makes Three. So yes, the picture book about two male penguins bringing up an egg and a baby penguin. This has been on the top 100 most banned and challenged books for the last 2 decades. When ALA, American Library Association, does its list by the decade of the most 100 challenged and banned, it's made it two decades in a row. And then lastly, sex is a funny word. Guessing the title may tell you why this one has had some problems. And it's a nonfiction account of puberty, changing bodies, and sex education. So those were just a couple I wanted to throw out as we were getting started. Also, I know you've already had a number of people in to talk about banned books. Looks like last week was Orwell and dystopians. You had people about the LGBTQ plus challenges in particular, Toni Morrison's Beloved. And so how do you think a conversation about challenging and banning books intended for children and teenagers, what do you think are some different considerations when you're talking about this audience than when you're talking about banning or challenging books for adult readers or in general? What do you think are some of the more specific concerns that come up with the under 18 crowd?
Is that a real question?
It's a real question.
Any answers? Any comments here? We're stunned. They don't normally wait to the end for questions.
Sorry. It's all my years of being a teacher. It's the idea that, if I start with a question, we'll draw them in. Yeah. But okay. Age appropriate. Yes, we never really worry a whole lot about the 47-year-old and whether or not they're ready for something. We spend a lot of time worrying about the 7-year-old or the 17-year-old and what they might be ready for. So yeah, age appropriate is definitely a big one. And as I go through the talk, what I'm hoping to do is just give a quick introduction to, do a quick introduction to some of the ideas, which may be a repeat from previous weeks, about censorship with challenging, banning, and self-censorship, and then move a little into some previous challenges and bans for children's books, which will then lead us up to where we are right now. Yay. I'm always thrilled when technology cooperates for me. So again, this may not be anything new, but the American Library Association talks about censorship as the suppression of ideas and information that some individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous. Censorship can take many, many forms, but today we're going to talk about book challenges and bans. So a challenge is when someone wants to restrict access or entirely remove materials, books, based on their contents. Not every challenge is successful, but if a challenge is successful, then it can become a book ban where the material is actually removed or contents are denied to a certain group. This is where the kid part usually comes in because materials may be taken out of the children's or the young adult collection, but may still be in the adult section of the library. So the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom has been tracking challenges and bans on libraries and schools since 1990 and compiling lists of the most frequently challenged and banned books every year, as well as decade by decade. So every year we get kind of a top 10 list of the most challenged and banned books, and every decade we get the top 100 from that decade. And some of the books on the list might really surprise you. However, what's not surprising is that there are always books for children and teenagers on the list because adults are frequently very invested in what children read. In large part because they do want to try to prevent kids from seeing what they themselves see as dangerous or wrong in the world. A lot of times people challenge books because they find the books themselves challenging. Something in the book makes them uncomfortable, nervous, scared. Something is challenging their sense of authority, their idea of how the world works. And they think that removing the book could be a solution to that problem. So this is from the American Library Association's Office of Intellectual Freedom. And the top 3 reasons for challenging books are usually that the material is considered sexually explicit, contains offensive language, and is unsuited to any age group. And of course, with all of these, there's a lot of room for what different individuals would find explicit or offensive. Most book challenges occur in school libraries, 44%, followed by public libraries at 37%, and then schools at 18%. Only about 1% happen at academic or other libraries. And the majority of challenges come from parents, library patrons, boards and administrators, and political and religious groups. But it's important again to note that some challenges do come from librarians and teachers themselves, about 6%, and about 1% come from students themselves. Also, challenges come from the political left, the political right, and every ideological perspective in between. So book challenges and bans are nothing new at all, but they have increased exponentially over the last year. So in 2021, the American Library Association tracked 729 challenges of 1,597 books, which is the most challenges of the most number of books they've had since they started tracking in 1990. And that's an over 367% increase from the number of challenges, 156 challenges of 273 books in 2020. ALA will not release the statistics for 2022, our current year, until April of 2023. So right now we don't have a good number for what this is going to be, but apparently people are expecting that the 2021 number is probably going to get broken based on how many challenges and bans have come up already in 2022. So we'll all be looking to see what that number looks like. Mm-hmm. So sometimes a person will put in a challenge of multiple books at the same time. So you might object to books that have sex ed basis. So you might want to get rid of this book as well as 2 other books that also teach kids sex education. Yeah, that one took me a minute when I was starting to look at this too. Good question, thanks. So these numbers are particularly disturbing because the American Library Association estimates that 82 to 97% of book challenges go unreported and receive no media attention. So even though this number shows such a huge increase, it's probably only the tip of the iceberg. There are probably lots of book challenges and book bannings that we're not hearing about because they're not being reported in any way. One of the things that doesn't always get talked about with censorship is it frequently leads to self-censorship or what's now being called soft censorship. And the idea is here that in these instances, because people are afraid of becoming a statistic and receiving bad publicity, they begin censoring themselves in an effort to prevent the challenges, prevent the bad publicity, and prevent the emotional toll and negative consequences that can often follow a book challenge, and especially a book ban. So in self-censorship, a librarian might decide not to purchase or display or book talk certain books that they think might draw the attention of would-be censors. So the book doesn't actually become a challenge because it doesn't have the opportunity to be read and potentially become a challenge. Teachers may second guess which books they would put in a classroom library, or to the extent possible, they may readjust their curriculum. School districts are certainly looking at curriculums right now and readjusting some of the books that are on curriculums because they're concerned about trying to nip challenges in the bud. But of course, this means that students then do not have the opportunity to experience those books. There are also concerns that publishers may decide they don't want to invest in certain books that could become controversial. And authors and illustrators may self-censor by simply deciding they're not going to create certain stories because they're afraid they won't get published. And they're afraid if they do get published, what kind of reception might they meet? So in a lot of ways, censorship has a lot of impacts below the surface that most people don't even get to see. And while a lot of these ideas of self-censorship are frequently seen as negative, a more positive type of self-censorship that gets discussed when people are opposing book challenges is the idea that children self-censor their own reading. Most kids will put down a book if it's something that they're not ready for. They'll either get bored by the topic or they'll realize it's scary and they'll walk away. And so this idea that kids will self-monitor their reading or self-censor their reading is often used as an argument against the idea that books need to be challenged or removed access from, because kids will usually figure out what they're ready for on their own. So a lovely book came out last year, You Can't Say That. Writers for Young People talk about censorship, free expression, and the stories they have to tell, which really looks at the idea of how authors and illustrators for children really have to think through the ideas of audience, what stories they're telling, how people may respond to those telling, and how scary it is sometimes to put those stories onto paper. And Leonard Marcus, who's a major scholar in children's literature, did the interviews and wrote the foreword. And he notes that the impulse to censor may indeed be too deeply ingrained in human nature to ever die out altogether, but the intensity with which it is acted upon ebbs and flows in sync with changes in society, especially society's shifting hopes and fears. And I think this is particularly apt to think about in terms of our current moment of book bans and challenges. What are people really afraid of? What's motivating this tsunami of challenges at this moment? And also to keep this in mind as we start going back through some of the earlier challenges to children's books. So, I mean, it's impossible to say when the first act of censorship would have taken place. But there's been censorship and debates about censorship since at least ancient Greece. Plato was actually okay with it. You know, he thought poets should not violate the ideas of morality and authority put forth by the government. Ancient Romans also tended to be fans. But in terms of the United States, the earliest instances of censorship directed against books for children and teenagers are read by children and teenagers. They may not have been really intended for them in terms of publishing, occurred in the late 1800s. So, dime novels. I don't know how many of you read these or how many of you are familiar with them, but they were the fascinating, exciting, very inexpensive literature of their day. So they were really popular in the late 1800s because they were, as dime novels suggest, pretty inexpensive, and they contained thrilling stories of adventure and excitement, and lots of people, children and teenagers and adults, all read them. At this point, there wasn't as big of a distinction between books for young people and books for a general readership the way we think about it today. And dime novels were incredibly popular with younger people, and something they could buy themselves usually. Anthony Comstock and the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice were not in favor of dime novels because they believed that they would, I quote, educate our youth in all the odious features of crime, because as you might imagine, in looking at some of these covers, crime was often part of the thrilling adventure that was happening in the story. So Comstock managed to get the publishers' less expensive second-class postage permits canceled, driving up publishers' costs, damaging their business, and denying access to readers who now couldn't get the latest serials and the latest dime novels because they weren't being shipped. The Comstock Act also made lots of other things illegal to send, including erotica and birth control pamphlets through the mail. So it was a way of making sure things did not travel very far to find readers. In 1885, whereas Comstock and his society were against dime novels as a whole genre category, in 1885, Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was banned by the Concord, Massachusetts Library for its coarseness of language. They did not care for the way that Huck and other characters spoke. And this ban was followed by others across the country. And Adventures of Huckleberry Finn remains a challenged and banned book in recent history, still often for the language, but the focus of the language that people object to has changed. So the book was really, when it came out in its initial decades, mostly criticized for being too progressive in its ideals. Huck and other characters may have had coarse language, but a lot of the other objections were to the way in which Huck helped Jim rather than turning Jim in. Over time, now the book is criticized for being too aggressive. I mean, the N-word is rampant in the book. There are over 350 instances of it. And historical context, that's not surprising, but it can be really jarring to a 21st century reader if there is not any preparation or context given to help get them ready for that. So this is a book like To Kill a Mockingbird that's run into challenges for its content really since it started, but the challenges have shifted as some societal ideas about race and integration have changed. So dime novels and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn were widely read by children and teens, but they were also read by adults, and they weren't created or published as separate works of children's literature cut off from the world of grown-up reading. So it's easy to see how these books, dime novels and Huck, came to the attention of adult readers, because adults were reading these things too. Dime novels were everywhere cheap books were sold, and Mark Twain was a literary icon decades before he got around to publishing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Still, when adults were concerned about young people reading these books, the concerns were usually about morality and the fears that children would imitate the characters they were reading about. Because, you know, young people read it, they're going to do it, seemed to be the shaky logic here. Jumping ahead to the 1930s, the story of Ferdinand, is this familiar to a lot of people? Okay, getting a few nods. So the lovely story of the bull who does not want to fight and instead just wants to sit under his cork tree and smell the flowers. This was one of the first books, explicitly written and published for kids. We've moved up a couple decades. By the 1930s, there are multiple children's publishing houses, and this book was written and published for a child audience. Not that adults can't love picture books too, I've got lots of them, but kids were the intended audience this time around, unlike the dime novels and Twain. But this book came out in 1936, and it was published 3 months after the Spanish Civil War began. So not the best timing necessarily for a book that's about bullfighting. Viking, the publisher, anticipated trouble and wanted to delay publication. But Monroe Leaf, the author, and Robert Lawson, the illustrator, wanted to move forward. So Viking did, albeit they did not give hardly any sort of marketing or publicity support. They put all of their funds behind books that really have not stood the test of time the way this one has today. But even so, this book became a sleeper hit, really taking off in 1937 and 1938. At the same time that this book was getting lots of fans and attention, people were Disney made a little movie version of it in 1938. People were making toys. Apparently there was even a little brooch you could buy with a cute little Ferdinand on it. I'd love to see that. So at the same time, it was getting a lot of positive response. It was also facing backlash abroad and in the United States. So the book was read as promoting communism. What color is it? It was read as promoting fascism because Ferdinand is determined to get his way, that he's not going to fight and no one can make him. And because he wouldn't fight, it was also determined to be promoting pacifism. A lot going on in this little picture book that Monroe Leaf says he wrote in less than an hour. So the book was banned and reportedly burned in Nazi Germany. So this was definitely not on Hitler's reading list. And it was also banned in Spain and was not published in Spain until after Francisco Franco had died. So this was one of the first, if not the first, picture books to receive international attention and criticism. And while it was banned in Germany and Spain, it does not seem to have been banned in the US. I can't find any accounts of the book getting banned here at home. However, it was still roundly criticized for the possible political messages of, especially of pacifism, and also for promoting an image of masculinity that wasn't focused on fighting. The idea that Ferdinand the Bull wanted to sit under the cork tree and smell the flowers really got criticized as trying to indoctrinate boys away from a quote unquote healthy sense of manhood. Yeah. So, it definitely had some issues here as well. And we were talking about Hemingway today at lunch, and Hemingway wrote a short story a couple decades after this came out about a Ferdinand who was proud to fight and, embodied all of the stereotypically masculine qualities. That was in some ways a response to this short story. So for as much controversy as this brought, and really was, again, one of the first children's books to get this kind of adult scrutiny, the book has never been out of print in the United States. And it's not a book that most people immediately think of when you think about a banned or a controversial book. This was my first favorite book as a toddler, read this all the time, and had no idea it was in any way controversial until I was doing research around the time the movie version came out. And then it was kind of like, oh my gosh, okay. So, sort of hidden depths perhaps for Ferdinand. Jumping ahead another couple of decades to the 1950s, Julia L. Mickenberg, who's an American Studies and children's lit scholar, published a fascinating book, Learning from the Left, about children's literature, the Cold War, and radical politics in the United States. And she says that in the 1950s, children's books were only very rarely banned from schools or libraries, and for the most part operated below the radar of red hunters. So during this decade, of course, lots of people were being blacklisted and graylisted from writing for adults, from television, from other media. But children's lit was just kind of deemed unimportant enough that most of these writers weren't creating, the children's books just weren't getting paid attention. So people who could no longer write for adults during this period, like Howard Fast, Franklin Folsom, Langston Hughes, Anne Terry White, Dorothy Sterling, Lewis Hartman, Priscilla Hiss, they all started writing for children. Most of them didn't even bother with a pseudonym. They used their own names. And again, because people weren't really paying very much attention to children's books, it didn't matter. The red hunters just were not particularly interested. So it gave a lot of leftist writers kind of second careers where they could write these books. Occasionally, there would be some very didactic books with clear social or political messages. The Communist Party did have a children's press. Most political groups do. But really, for the most part, people who were now writing for blacklisted, graylisted writers who were writing for kids were generally just writing general children's books with subtle messages, if messages at all, and were not investing in politics. So the books were flying under the radar. There would be some attention drawn to children's books in the mid-50s in terms of their effectiveness in teaching children how to read. And there was a lot of criticism for the Dick and Jane primers and other books that they didn't think were teaching children to read effectively. But no one was really concerned at this moment about messages or content in children's books. And the 1950s were a phenomenal decade for children's literature. In some ways, not surprisingly, with the baby boom, there were a lot of readers who needed books, and books were starting to be seen as something that houses, that families should have. Schools and libraries should have them too. That was great. But this was also the decade in which people started building, it was more common for people to start building small children's libraries in their homes so that kids could read at home too. And some scholars, including Mickenberg, have argued that the increasing freedom of children's books in the 50s paved the way for the much more convention-breaking books of the 1960s, and also for the more radical citizens, young citizens, the flower children in the 1960s as well. However, while everything seemed fairly non-censored in children's books, strictly speaking, the comics industry was not doing well in the 1950s. And comics, again, like dime novels, were things that were read by millions of people, children, teenagers, and adults. And while there were certainly some comics marketed specifically for kids, most of the comics that older children and teens were enjoying were also being enjoyed by adults. Comics were not considered part of children's literature when they were created in the 1930s and would not be considered part of children's literature officially for decades. Most librarians and teachers did not include comics in their collections, and most librarians and teachers did not encourage comic reading with their students or recommend to parents that they have their children read comics, because children's literature was still very much growing as a field, and teachers, librarians, publishers were really encouraging book-buying citizens, mostly adults, to buy officially sanctioned, approved children's books that were coming out of children's publishing houses and that were being promoted by and vetted by teachers and librarians. Comics did not fit this bill. Neither did the series books like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. So these books were not frequently included in recommended reading for kids or in libraries. That being said, they were still books that kids read all the time. And so in the face of comics' popularity with young readers, other people began to get concerned about them. And psychiatrist Frederick Wortham published what became a really influential, now infamous book, Seduction of the Innocent, The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth, where he argued that the violent images and storylines in comic books were rendering young readers insensitive to violence and promoting them to be more likely to commit their own violent acts and crimes. So you can see some of the dime novel ideas about needing to remove images of violence from young readers resurfacing again. And Wortham carried his concerns all the way to the hearings of the United States Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, which were televised in 1953. And this really created, this kind of wiped out the comic industry for about 40 years. So in an effort to survive, the Comics Magazine Association of America in 1954, the year after his book came out and after he had testified on television about the dangers of comics, the Comics Code was created, which is basically a self-regulatory or self-censoring body that created rules and regulations that comics publishers, producers, and creators would all agree to uphold in their work. So if you wanted to publish a comic book, it needed to have this lovely little stamp on it, letting everyone know that it had indeed been approved by the Comics Code Authority. And getting the stamp, they needed to prohibit explicit content, prevent criticism or disrespectful portrayals of authority figures, and promote respect for morality and honorable behavior. Again, recognizing that these definitions are pretty broad and could mean different things to different people. But the code was created ostensibly to protect young readers, as well as salvage what was left of the comics industry. But of course, also thinking more again about self-censorship and now actual censorship, it kept comics creators and publishers from embarking on any kind of new storylines or formats, or continuing previously popular adventure series, which is how they lost a lot of readers through disinterest as well as adult intervention. And really, we wouldn't see comics gain widespread popularity or appreciation among adults again until the late 1980s and early 1990s, when things like Art Spiegelman's Mouse elevated the genre and drew a lot of attention. And comics wouldn't really gain traction in the officially sanctioned world of children's literature until about the early 2000s, when graphic novels became more accepted, and graphic novels then were endorsed by teachers, librarians, and caregivers in terms of recognizing their value with visual literacy, etc. So while most children's books, except for comics, were escaping censorship in the 1950s, one other made a lot of headlines, The Rabbit's Wedding, written and illustrated by Garth Williams and published in 1958. It was first banned by the Alabama State Library Circulating Collection, and then other libraries in the South followed suit because ostensibly the book promoted interracial marriage, since the little white rabbit and the little black rabbit get married at the end of the book. And so the two little rabbits were wed and lived together happily in the big forest, eating dandelions, playing jump the daisies, run through the clover, and find the acorn all day long. And it's not a Garth Williams one that's well known because of the controversy. It went out of print for years. It's been brought back. You can now get it. But and Garth Williams is a big deal. He illustrated Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, the Little House on the Prairie books. But this was one of his books that did not have a long life when it first came out because it got a lot of attention and not the kind that people necessarily wanted. So Justice Monroe Leaf had claimed that he wasn't political when he wrote the story of Ferdinand, that he just wanted to do a book about a bull because he was tired of all the books about mice and bunnies and cute little woodland creatures. Garth Williams claimed that The Rabbit's Wedding wasn't political, that he just wanted to make sure that when the book was printed, there would be strong enough contrast between the two different rabbits so that you could follow along which rabbit was which in the story. I've always wondered about that, I've got to admit, that he didn't think about it, or no one in the publishing house in 1958 thought, oh, I wonder if anyone will interpret this differently. But that is the official version he has left us with. And like I said, the book is now back in print, should anyone want it. And then jumping into today. So right now, the book challenges and bans are coming in almost so quickly that there's a new one to think about or research or talk about almost every day. I was at ALA in June, and it just felt like we all sat around and swapped stories about which challenges had come in at which library and how different people were responding. But I know one of the ones that you might be familiar with because it got a lot of media attention was the McKinn County School Board in Tennessee's decision to remove Art Spiegelman's Mouse from its 8th grade curriculum. The decision to remove the book was based off of 8 curse words in the book and an image of a nude female mouse who represents a Jewish woman in a concentration camp. So at first, the school director suggested redacting the words and image, which is also a form of censorship, but the board just decided to remove the entire book instead. And so a book that's been used very often for Holocaust education with junior high, high school, college students no longer fit their definition of what was appropriate. So they took it out and said they would be looking for a new book to replace it. I could not find in searching any kind of publicity about how that search is going or what the new book is going to be. But following the board's decision in January, millions of people rose to Mouse's defense on social media, also donating copies of the book to kids within the McCann School District and beyond, and purchasing copies for themselves and others. Mouse became the #1 best-selling book on Amazon within a week of this decision going viral. And of course, this is wonderful, but it's also a level of support that many banned books don't receive. So when the 2021 top 10 most banned and challenged books list was released by the American Library Association in April, It was a mix of books that had been banned before and books that were making their debut on this particular list. But the trend of books being challenged because of containing LGBTQ plus content and discussions about race and racism reflect current preoccupations in education, legislation, and society. Genderqueer is a graphic memoir that explores questions about discovering one's gender identity and sexuality. Again, it was published by an adult publisher, but presumably for an adult or general audience. But it was on the Alex Award list, which is a list of books selected by the Young Adult Library Services Association for having special appeal to young adults. It's written for an entirely different audience than And Tango Makes Three, but both books have been challenged for having LGBTQ plus content. And concerns about gender roles and identity raised by this book also echo some of concerns about Ferdinand the Bull's supposed lack of traditional masculinity. The Hate You Give is a YA novel published by a YA publisher, presumably for young adult readers, although half the young adult audience now is made up of adults over 25. But it's about a Black teenage girl who witnesses her unarmed Black childhood friend being shot by a police officer during a traffic stop, and how she and her community deal with the after effects. The book was challenged for profanity, violence, and being anti-police. The profanity complaint is similar to the one for Mouse in Tennessee, focus on those identified bad words, as well as concerns about coarseness of language for Huckleberry Finn. Challenges against violent content we've seen with the dime novels and comics, and The Hate You Give was not the only book on the list that explored institutional racism. I know you had Jean talk about Toni Morrison's Beloved a few weeks ago. One of her other novels, The Bluest Eye, was also on this list of top 10 challenged and banned books for last year because of issues with racism. So the concerns of people who seek to challenge and ban books for young readers may not have changed significantly, but other elements of book bans certainly have. With the rise in popularity of children's and young adult books and the success of blockbusters like Harry Potter, Twilight, The Hunger Games, it's much harder now for a children's book to go under the radar than it might have been in the 1950s. With the internet, reviews of children's books are really readily available, and we're seeing more reviews by everyday readers and concerned citizens, as well as professional book evaluators, which has pros and cons. But, the joy of the media, social media, the internet, again, pros and cons, anyone can publish what they're thinking. And that's great, but also that has meant that some children's books have gotten undue attention for one objection that someone may have raised that has gone viral that may not really reflect the book itself. So how do we counter that with social media? And because with social media, again, it's much easier to raise awareness around a book and a challenge or a ban. So what used to be a local community issue with very few breakouts, except for maybe Ferdinand, the Rabbit's Wedding, and Tango Makes Three, it's now much easier for a local challenge or ban to receive national and international attention. Also, preventing access to certain books has now become part of social media campaigns, political campaigns, and legislation. And challenges and bans used to be focused much more on the books themselves and maybe the book's creators and publishers. Now, some people who seek to ban books are going after the teachers and librarians who make the books available, attacking them personally and professionally, online, in the media, and in meetings. People have even sought criminal charges against librarians in multiple states for making some books that they deem obscene or inappropriate. For example, in Wyoming, one librarian the idea of pressing criminal charges for having sex as a funny word in her library was brought up just because it was on the shelves. The efforts have all failed so far. So far, there have not been any successful challenges to criminalize a librarian or a teacher for having a book available. But this wasn't something that was happening in earlier challenges and bans. This seems to be a new, more direct attack on the people who are providing the books to young audiences. I'm going to do this last bit really quickly so we've got time for questions. I did want to say that in children's literature classes, library classes, education classes, lots of time is spent on the idea of selection versus censorship because, of course, as much as you might want to, no one has the budget, let alone the shelf space, to buy every single book to have in a library. So you're making choices based on your community, your community's needs. And so a lot of time is spent in training librarians and teachers in how to evaluate books and how to make decisions about which books they're going to have on the shelves, as well as which books they are going to possibly promote. So anyone grow up reading Little House on the Prairie books? I certainly did. Little House on the Prairie has faced some challenges in recent years because of the representations of Native Americans in the books and because Pa does minstrel shows in blackface. And so, again, as far as I know, I have not found any place where Little House on the Prairie has been banned. But there have definitely been discussions in classes I've had where Little House on the Prairie has been looked at and talked about in terms of making sure it's available on the shelves should people want to read it, because it is still a popular book. And it's especially a book that a lot of mothers and grandmothers like to introduce to the next generation. But also maybe having it either not front and center in a book display, finding it on the shelf rather than having it prominently featured. And also, if it is being featured or talked about or included in a class reading or library, making sure that you also have other books that show other perspectives from that same moment in history. So I've paired it, as have other people, with Louise Erdrich's The Birch Bark House and Linda Sue Park's Prairie Lotus to look at an Ojibwe perspective of a young girl growing up in this era, or looking at a girl who is half Chinese growing up in this era and coming from California to Nevada, crossing the prairie. So some of these ideas about selection dominate discussions in children's lit library and education classes, as well as professional journals. And so a lot of time is spent trying to decide how to select the best books for young readers. We also have an increasing number of books written for young readers that tackle some of these questions about censorship and banning. These are 4 middle grade novels that have all come out within the last 6 years that really tackle what happens when a book challenge or ban is in your community, your school, and how the kids respond. Answers in the Pages by David Levithan and A.S. King's Attack of the Black Rectangles both actually have come out in 2022. And Answers in the Pages looks at a student whose teacher has assigned a book where the main characters may or may not be gay. It's not really clear. Students get to make up their own minds. And that student's parent is the one who leads the effort to have that book removed from the curriculum. And so it's a really interesting engagement with family dynamics, as well as what do you do when this happens in your school. And Attack of the Black Rectangles is based on a real life experience with the author's son, where his copy of The Devil's Arithmetic by Jane Yolen, which is a Holocaust novel frequently read in middle schools, junior highs, sometimes high schools, had black rectangles. The teacher had gone in and removed words that she did not think the students could handle, which turned out to be words like breasts related to female development that she did not think would create too many giggles and disturbances in the class, so she blacked them out. And this book was the author's response to that in terms of letting the kids find this in their books, then go get the real book, explore what had been blacked out and why, and their responses to it. So, in terms of bringing things to the next generation, and I'm expecting we're going to see more of these, it's really interesting that people are writing a lot right now about censorship for young readers themselves so that they know what's happening in schools and libraries around them. And then if you are interested in finding out more about how professional organizations are responding right now, here are 4 terrific ones that all have various resources devoted to ending and countering censorship. Brooklyn Public Library is also doing a great Books Unbanned, where right now, for a limited time, any teenager can get an e-card to check out virtual books from their library, so that if they can't get any challenged or banned books in their local libraries, they can get access electronically to books out of the Brooklyn Library. So that's been a really interesting response this spring. And banned book clubs are sprouting up all over. Libraries, schools, lots of organizations are, so you can support the big major organizations, but if you like to think local, act local, there are also a lot of smaller community initiatives right now that students as well as adults are getting involved with to read more banned books and have some of these conversations. And so thank you. What questions do you have?
When I first looked up at the slide 2 ago with the titles, my eyes saw attack, and then I saw librarians, and I thought Attack of the Rebel Librarians, and I know we have a lot here, so they should write that book. You want to help me with that? Anybody?
Looks like
Your chance
looks like
to
there's
grab
a
the mic.
woman toward the back.
Have any books been banned because of inappropriate illustrations?
Yes. So, one of the first ones that got a lot of the attention, there's nothing about nudity in any of the language in this book, but because Mickey in the illustration is nude, that was why this book has been banned. And there are other books, I'm trying to think right now, that have illustrations that have gotten them in trouble. Usually it's more the idea in the book, so sometimes that's in the text and the illustrations. I think about that being more common. But even like Mouse, one of the objections there, okay, 8 bad words, obscene words, curse words in the text, but an image of a naked mouse/woman. So the image was objected to as well as the words.
All right, hold on 1 minute, Ms. Frasher.
Yes, I would just, my comment was in response to that, and that if some of you may remember Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, and the police officer was represented as a pig, and that was the objection.
Oh, I'd forgotten all about that one, but yes, that was another one.
Okay, Rick Gold, if you'll unmute.
Thanks so much. You really added a lot to all of the previous lectures that we had, and I think that was a really fine presentation. Regarding Mouse, I've taken a look at the transcript of the meeting of the school board, and you're right that they talk about the image of a naked mouse. Actually, it's a mother who commits suicide, and also some of the words. But what's not said is why are these so terrible that the book has to be banned? And the question that comes to my mind is that a lot of the objections about pornography, sexual references, LGBTQ issues have to do with the rise of Christian nationalism in this country and the efforts to impose Christianity as the national religion. In addition, there also is efforts by the political right to delegitimize schools and libraries I'm wondering if you could talk about those issues.
Oh gosh, those are not small issues at all. But no, you're right. A lot of the bans right now are coming from right-wing groups that are organizing and also from some religious groups. I really appreciated in Tennessee some of the churches. I believe one of them was an Episcopal church that chose to do a community reading of Maus after this happened in the schools as a way to try to talk about that anti-Semitism needed to be an issue for everyone, whatever religion they might be. But these are definitely things that are huge concerns right now, especially in terms of bringing that sense of national or international attention and organization to something that before may have been more of a local challenge or issue, now has a much larger network of people who are supporting a challenge or a ban. Again, sometimes I guess the flip side, I have to remind myself with that is there are now also with more people able to come to the defense of a book in a larger way than there might have been before. But no, those are huge challenges. And it also goes back to sometimes what isn't being said in a book challenge. I mean, okay, they objected to the 8 words and the 1 image in this book. They're not talking about the context of these words or that image and how they fit within the overall book, let alone within American and world history. And I think so often with the book challenges and bans, it's focusing on the little things that they think are easy to fight about or argue for, and not wanting to talk about some of the larger elephants in the room, like anti-Semitism or institutional racism, that are really the things that could scare adults in the book. And they don't want to open that door and start having that conversation. So they try to find the things like curse words that are easy to highlight and say, we're upset about the book for this reason.
I have a comment about the age-appropriate books and then a question. The major concern, it seems to me, of older teenagers is that of self-awareness and coming of age. Who am I? What am I? What's happening in my life? So, am I the only one like that who's having these problems? And so my comment is, in books like Diary of a Part-Time Indian, The Hate You Give, 13 Reasons, those are issues that are very much age appropriate for at least older adolescents. And yet they're among the most often banned books. So the question is, do people who are trying to ban the published books not think about the total exposure that their children are having to the real world in terms of talking about it with their peers, watching television? They see things, they hear things that would be banned if they were in the books. Why are only the books bad and not the violence and the everything happening in other forms of media?
I think in large part because it's easy. You can't ban real life, sadly, sometimes, but also good. I think the books in some ways are the easiest thing to get upset about and to think you can have the most control over. The books. You can also control what your kids watch on TV or which movies they see. To a certain extent, we all know they're also going to have friends probably, which means they could get access to books and movies and music that you may have said no to, but they may still find a way. I think some of it is the idea that it's easier to cut down or try to crack down on books than it is when everything is scary in the world. If you can crack down on books, maybe that's the idea that you have something you can control. I also, and maybe I'm a book person, so that changes my opinion, or influences my opinion. But I also think even in our digital age, there's still something about books and education that convey an extra sort of legitimacy that we don't quite give the same weight to with a movie or a TV show. Books, because they do still have a strong connotation with education, especially in a school or a library. There's something that has extra weight that people, I think, respond to and wanting to then attack the book more than some of these other forms of media. And, I still want books to have that kind of sacred weight for sure, but it does probably make them targets more for some of these organized efforts or for people's fears about a topic than other forms of exposure, or just recognizing that your kids are probably going to encounter an awful lot of this in the world just by living.
What is the procedure in banning a book? Now, that may be a very big question. Is it local? Is it national?
It's local. For the most part, it's local. Sometimes there's things that go up to state levels, but for the most part, it's local. So in classes with future teachers and librarians, I always make sure they do their homework on the school districts that they're looking at and making sure that they know what the policies are. At this point, most schools have policies, most libraries have policies. Every once in a while, you'll find one that doesn't. But most do have a process in place. If someone wants to make a complaint or a challenge to a book, there is a process they are supposed to go through, paperwork, committees, before the book is removed from shelves. That being said, the process is not always followed the way it's supposed to be, but most places do have a process in place. And so it's really important that people know how that works in their local communities.
I guess that I raised children back in the dark ages, but I think parental involvement from the minute they're born until you get rid of them out the door is really one of the key elements. And I can remember nursing one little baby and while reading a book to the older sibling at the same time. And then these later years, they would say, well, Mom, stay up and watch this program on TV with me. And I thought, oh, man. And again, I kept the door open. I didn't forbid that they couldn't read it, but I loved when they shared it with me and we talked about it. And I still think that's important today, but we got to keep them reading.
Mm-hmm. No, keep them reading and keep them talking about what they've read. I mean, if you can really engage with the book, if there are things that in the book that you may be concerned about them reading, okay, you read the book with them. You make sure that as they're reading the book, you can have a dialogue about it, raise some questions rather than just shutting down the conversation completely.
Could I make one comment about that? And you mentioned the Little House on the Prairie books. I grew up, my mother was a librarian. My father really enjoyed books. One of the things we loved to do was to sit around after dinner and read books to each other. And so we read all of the Little House books by passing them around between Mom, Dad, and me, and each of us would read a part of a chapter. And it's one of the wonderful memories I have of my childhood is passing the Little House books around and reading them and talking about them. Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to share that.
A while back, Nathan Crabb had a book in his editorial, Red, which is a story of two crayons that a group in someplace in Florida had banned. And I happened to have a copy, so I was able to show it to several people around Oakhammock. And they read that and just shook their head like, what could this be? So the premise that the parent had, that child would never get that from reading that book unless a parent had described that to him. Now, and the second thing, I'm concerned, libraries have their system in place if a book is questionable. But I've heard that there are some classrooms that this has been a wonderful, we want to encourage children to read. And so classroom libraries have been very popular. So books are accessible to them, not the once a week that they can go to the library. And some teachers with they're just concerned that something is going to happen to reflect back. And is this book appropriate?
No, unfortunately, that is definitely happening. I've heard of friends who teach in some school districts where they are being encouraged. I don't think anyone is being mandated yet, but they are being encouraged to either carefully cull their classroom libraries or remove their classroom libraries right now because of potential challenges coming in, and school district are worried about having another thing to deal with, an important thing to deal with, in my opinion. But yeah, school classroom libraries are definitely taking a hit. When you think about how many times we've spent decades trying to teach teachers how to build up a classroom library, and the importance of that resource, along with the school library. And right now, like I said, either really, really going through it and making sure you know all the books in it and what they're about, or possibly not having one, which is not a good option.
I think you just are covering some of this, but my biggest concern would be from the state mandating downward. And you know that's happening now. And because the governor and doesn't want people to be upset that they're trying to teach diversity, for instance. And that is scary. I mean, you talk about totalitarianism. That's what it is. And let's see, it was, what's the other thing besides diversity was, you don't want to be uncomfortable about the Black situation, the African Americans. We don't want to even talk about them.
Correct. And the easy response is learning should almost always be uncomfortable. Learning is hard. Learning about history, learning about other people, learning about how to get along in this world, all of that is hard. Just because it's hard and uncomfortable doesn't mean we don't need to do it. I know I'm preaching to the choir with this group, but
yeah. If you have just 2 more minutes, I have a question here online and then a comment. Rick, go ahead again.
Thanks. Just following up on that question, another motto of Governor DeSantis is parental rights in education. And, of course, it's important for parents to bring up their kids, and it's important for parents to speak out about the way schools are operated. But in addition to parents, residents of the school district pay taxes for the schools, and they have a right as well to speak out about how the schools are managed and operated. I was wondering how you might respond to the argument that parental rights means that parents have the right to remove books for everyone. How do we respond to that?
I go to the ALA, American Library Association statement, which is parents have the right to work with what their children read. The only person who should be able to tell a kid what they can't read is a parent, or I presume caregiver or guardian. Parents do not have the right to tell other parents or other children what they can or can't read. So, I just tend to go back to the American Library Association and their statements on kids' reading rights. And they've got lovely white papers and websites and things that can really, Office of Intellectual Freedom is great in terms of laying out different arguments that you can make. But the real thing that they keep coming back to again is a parent may be able to say what their child or children can't read, but one parent should not be able to speak for all the parents or all the residents who are supporting an education system.
Okay, Ms. Farwell?
Yes, I have an example to bring up
Hold the mic up, please.
that we discussed briefly earlier, and that is the Sunshine State Young Readers Award. That is a reading program for students in grades 3 through 8 that, in fact, is sponsored by the state. I served on one of the committees of librarians and teachers who selected those books for 3 years. And one of the concepts that you mentioned earlier was about teachers themselves making decisions about what books to choose and put into libraries. And in particular, onto a reading list sponsored by the state of Florida. This is widely promoted every year. All the Barnes and Nobles I know and other bookstores around the state will typically have a display of books. Briefly, there's 20 books on 2 different lists. Okay, there is a 3 to 5 list, and then there is a 4 to 8 list. And that's because some of those kids in reading levels makes a difference. So you've got to have an overlap year there.
Yeah.
And so the state, in fact, pays for us to paid hotel and meals for us to go to these meetings. And it would typically be over a weekend. I can remember coming here to Gainesville from Miami for one of these meetings. And there were a number of criteria that we were given as we had to read books all year long. We had to read like 300 books. And then we had to come and pick them on a particular weekend. So you had to choose your favorites and get your arguments in line. We wanted diverse genres, fantasy books, realistic fiction, so forth. And we also wanted them on a variety of reading levels because that's a major concern. Another thought that we had to be given by the supervisor of school libraries working for the state in Tallahassee, how likely was this book to bring up objections from parents and school boards? So there you go, perfect example of what you were saying. One of my best friends was a supervisor of school libraries in the state for 8 years. And she would be there. She would try not to participate too much in the discussion because she wanted it to come from a diverse group of librarians around the state. But she would occasionally make a comment about how many phone calls she would get in Tallahassee. To give that a consideration about whether because it would be brought up to the local county school board. So yes, you're right. That had to be a consideration. Also, multiple copies of these books would be purchased. 10 to 15 copies of each one, typically. So it was a monetary issue coming out of the library budget. And so these are issues that could not be ignored because my friend would tell me how many calls she got on a particular book in a particular year. Because private schools are involved in this. Religious schools had representatives come to that meeting and participate as a fully voting member to choose a book. So you were very appropriate in bringing up that as a consideration in terms of what to choose for a library, but also in terms what to choose to promote across the state. And when Tallahassee was paying for this.
Yeah, I'm glad I've gotten to know a little bit more about the Sunshine State Award. I love book awards. They're definitely one of my favorite things. So that is something I'm going to need to learn more about now that I'm back in Florida.
All right. Thank you very much again to Ramona Caponegro for her excellent presentation. on children's books. Ramona?
Thank you.
And we've got one more to go, folks. Next week, we're going to have someone who I think is familiar to most of you, and that is Dr. Paul Ortiz, who's going to talk to us about Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, and also probably bring up something about his own book that has been banned. All right, we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you again.